Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Hey, before we get started, there's a couple things I want to encourage you to do. First, I want to encourage you to make sure you've got a copy of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. I also want to encourage you to make sure you have some communion elements. You'll want to have some bread or a cracker. You want to have some juice or some wine, or if you don't have juice or wine, really any beverage would suffice. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So, if you need any or all of those things, then I would encourage you just to pause the playback right now. Go ahead and pull together whatever you need. Once you've got everything in place, then you can go ahead and resume the playback. Has there ever been a time in your life when you encountered a mysterious stranger and then later on you realized that you actually knew who this mysterious stranger was? Has that ever happened to you? About 2.5 decades ago, when I was an associate pastor at a church in eastern Michigan, I had been out of town for a ministry conference and I was flying back into the Detroit airport. Now, at that time, I was dating a young woman from that church. She was on the worship team at that church. She was a singer. She had long blonde hair, really pretty girl, a really neat young lady. And so this was the mid-late 90s, and so this was the point at which we did have cell phones, but they weren't smartphones like we have now. They were actually pretty dumb phones back then, and so as soon as I got into the airport, I was expecting to see her there waiting for me at the gate. You remember, again, this was before 9/11 when people could just wander around freely in the airport, and so that had been our plan, was for her to meet me there at the gate. But I got off the plane and she wasn't there, and it was a little bit surprising to me because she was a very responsible young lady. And so I thought, well, what do I do? So I just waited there for a few minutes. You know, the Detroit airport is an extremely busy airport. There were literally hundreds of people that were milling all around, and I didn't see her. I did notice that there was kind of a goth girl that was over to the side who was kind of staring at me, and so I was trying to kind of ignore this goth girl that was over there who was kind of staring at me. But after a while, I went ahead and tried calling on my cell phone, and she didn't answer. I tried calling her cell phone because she had one. I also tried calling her home phone just in case maybe she'd forgotten, but no answer at her cell phone, no answer at her home phone. So I thought, well, I don't know. I guess I better go to baggage claim. So I went ahead and I headed downstairs to baggage claim. I got my bags and then I kind of looked around. I had left a voicemail or 2 or 3 at this point, letting my girlfriend know that I was at baggage claim at this point, and once she arrived at the airport, just to head down there to meet me, but I still didn't see her. As it so happened, this was one of the later flights in the day, and at this point, the hundreds of people that had been milling around earlier, they were all starting to kind of clear out. And so down here now in the bowels of the airport, down in baggage claim, I'm sitting there. I'm still calling her phone. No one answers. I'm trying to call her home phone. No one's answering there. And I'm thinking to myself, what do I do? And I'm looking around, and the airport is kind of starting to clear out. It's pretty much me and the people who worked for the airport, and oh good, now the goth girl is down here and she's still kind of staring at me, and so I'm trying not to let that freak me out too much. So I am just kind of at my wit's end. So after a while I thought, I guess I'm going to call her like for the 8th, 9th, 10th time at this point. So I looked down at my phone, and as I looked down at my phone, someone came up behind me and grabbed me around the waist. And I thought, oh good, she's here. And so I turned around, and it wasn't my girlfriend, it was the goth girl. The goth girl that had been staring at me upstairs, staring me down in baggage claim. She has come up and she's grabbed me from behind. And so I think I jumped about 3 feet in the air. And then I kind of stared at her for a minute, and I kind of stared at her for a minute more. And then I realized that this goth girl was my girlfriend, and that my girlfriend, this pretty blonde girl that was on the church worship team, had totally disguised herself and had dressed in black from head to toe. She had put on the heavy black eyeliner like goth people do. She actually wore a black short-haired wig for this. It was probably the best prank that anyone has ever pulled on me in my entire life. And I don't know if that ex-girlfriend will ever see this video. If she ever does, I want to let her know that was that was an outstanding prank. You got me good, and no one has ever topped that, at least as far as I'm concerned. Incidentally, that ex-girlfriend, she is now married and has a beautiful family. She no longer lives in Eastern Michigan either, but I think that God has truly blessed her and in her life as well. But all of that is simply to say that I have had an experience with a mysterious stranger that once I saw him face to face, I realized, oh my goodness, I know who this is. And that is exactly what is going to happen to Jacob in the lectionary Old Testament scripture for October 16th of 2022. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at the lectionary passage. This is Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 31, and this is the passage in its entirety. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with Jacob till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower Jacob, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that Jacob's hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What's your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But the man replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then the man blessed Jacob there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above Jacob as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. May God bless the reading of this fascinating passage, of the fascinating word. So, my guess is that you have heard this passage many times before. I'm sure you've heard sermons on this passage. I'm sure you've had Sunday school lessons on this passage. I'm sure you've done Bible studies on this passage. This is one of the well-known passages from the Old Testament. Nevertheless, what I'd like to do is take just a little bit closer look at it, make sure that we kind of understand what's happening in this passage. And then, after we talk through the passage a little bit more at length, then what we'll do is we'll focus on 3 of the most important lessons that this passage has for us. So, the beginning of the passage, it tells us that Jacob is on the road. He's traveling with his 2 wives and with his servants and with his sons. And it tells us that they are about to cross the river Jabbok. Now, I didn't mention this before I kind of started into the passage, but where were they headed? Well, they were headed back for their homeland. Very quickly, just want to remind you about this story of Jacob. Jacob was born one of 2 twin sons. And you remember, of course, that Jacob's twin brother was Esau. You probably remember that Esau was born first, Jacob was born second, and that when Esau was born, that Jacob was actually holding on to the heel, almost as if to say, "No, I want to be born first. Don't get born first." And that really kind of sets the theme for everything that happens after that. Because again, if you remember the story of Jacob and Esau, you know that Esau, as the oldest son, he was entitled to a double portion of the birthright for the family. He was also entitled to the spiritual inheritance for the family. And Jacob was very unhappy about that. Jacob wanted the physical inheritance, he wanted the land, he wanted the wealth, but he also wanted the spiritual inheritance as well. And he felt like Esau didn't really care about those things, which I'm sure bothered him a lot. So you probably remember the story about the time when Esau, who had grown up into a manly young man, had been out hunting in the fields and came in one day and was famished while Jacob had been cooking some really good stew. And so Esau says, I want some of that stew. And Jacob says, I'll give you some of the stew, but you got to give me your birthright. And in what is probably the worst negotiation of all time, Esau said, okay, just give me the stew. So Esau gets a bowl of stew, and Jacob ends up with now Esau's birthright. Now I want you to think about that for just a sec. Isaac, their father, only had the two sons. He had Jacob, he had Esau, but Esau was the firstborn. And so you got two sons, but the oldest son gets a double portion of the birthright. So this is what Esau is entitled to, this double portion over here. Jacob gets a single portion over here. But now, for a bowl of stew, Jacob gets everything. Everything. I mean, it just is incredible that Esau agreed to that over a bowl of stew. But he did. And so at this point, and I should back up. So when the gravity of this situation really hit Esau, Esau was really unhappy about that. Now, not only did that happen, not only did Jacob take advantage of Esau in a moment of weakness, but the father there in the story, Isaac, he had planned to give the family's spiritual blessing, nevertheless, the spiritual birthright, as it were, he had planned to give that to Esau. And so, Jacob, knowing this, goes and disguises himself as Esau, goes to his father and says, all right, I'm ready for the spiritual blessing. And Isaac, the father, says, boy, it's weird. You really seem like Jacob, but right now as I'm feeling your burly, hairy arms that I know that Esau has, it seems like you're Esau, so okay, here's the family's spiritual blessing. I bestow it to you. So Jacob had tricked his own father into giving him the spiritual birthright as well. So now, for all intents and purposes, Jacob has everything. Esau has nothing. And when Esau found out about this, he wanted to kill Jacob. So that was the point at which Jacob got out of town and Jacob went to a foreign land. You probably remember the story of Jacob and Leah and Rachel. And that's another crazy story in itself. It's a story where Jacob pulls off or tried to pull off some of his shenanigans. And actually, Jacob's father-in-law probably got the best of Jacob in some of those shenanigans. Jacob finally met a deceiver who was more experienced than he was. But after all this time has passed, Jacob has finally decided that he wants to head back home. And he has sent word, because he knows that Esau is still there, that he's coming home. He hopes everything is going to be okay. He hopes that everything is just water under the bridge at this point. And Jacob has heard, though, that Esau is on his way and he's bringing 400 men with him. That doesn't sound good, does it? So Jacob is heading for what sounds like a really scary confrontation with his long estranged brother and 400 men that he's bringing with him. It sounds like it's going to be bad. And that's when this happens. So, very quickly, he's crossing the river, everyone's across, everything's across, and all of a sudden this mystery man shows up and starts wrestling Jacob. And they wrestle all through the night. And at some point, when the man realizes that he's not going to overpower Jacob, it says that he touches the hip, or the socket of Jacob's hip, and his hip is thrown out of socket. I can't even imagine how painful that must have been. And he says, all right, the wrestling match is over, it's time for me to go. It's a stalemate, but it's daybreak and I got to go. And Jacob says, no, I'm not letting you go. Not until you bless me. Because at some point, Jacob has obviously realized that this is no ordinary human being that he's wrestling with. At some point, Jacob has realized that he is wrestling with God. So, God says, "What's your name?" And Jacob says, "Jacob," of course. And God responds, "All right, you're not going to be Jacob anymore. You're going to be Israel, because you struggled with God and with humans, and you have overcome." We'll come back and we're going to talk more about that here in a couple minutes. Jacob says, "Tell me your name." And God says, "Why would you even ask that? You know who I am." And so then it tells us that Jacob calls this place Peniel, which means I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. Because they believed in ancient times that if you saw God face to face, or if you saw God, period, that you would die. And do you have time for just a side tangent? One thing I want to point out to you real quick, this has really nothing to do with the sermon itself. But Peniel, or Peniel, anytime you see those two letters, E-L together, E-L means God. In all of the names in the Bible, anytime you see E-L together, that means God, or of God, or to God, or whatever. In this case, Peniel, Penny means face, and El means God. Let's look at another El name in this passage, Israel, Israel. Israel means struggles with God. We'll talk more about that here in a couple minutes as well. And we didn't even talk about the episode in Jacob's life when he had the dream where he saw angels ascending and descending a ladder or a stairway to heaven. You know where Jacob was when he had that dream. He was in Bethel, Beth-El, which means house of God. Anyway, that's just a side tangent. No extra charge for that. Anyhow, let's go ahead now and let's focus very quickly on the three lessons this passage has for us. The first lesson is this: as people of faith, there will be times when we struggle with God. As people of faith, there will be times when we struggle with God. Did you know before just now that the name Israel means struggles with God? Isn't that an interesting name for God's chosen people, for the nation that God ordained, that it means struggles with God? But you know what? I mean, that's the reality of the life of most people, if not all people of faith. All of us struggle with God at times. In this passage, Jacob literally struggles with God. But you know that the Hebrew people through the ages have struggled with God. And I think that all of us who consider ourselves to be people of faith, whether we're Hebrew, whether we're Jewish or not, all of us would say we've struggled with God. With some people, we maybe have struggled with disappointment when something happened and we felt like, God, why did you allow that to happen? Sometimes we may have struggled with anger towards God. Maybe something took place and we were really, really unhappy with God about it and angry about it. There have been plenty of people in the Bible, men and women, who were angry with God. Or maybe the struggle is just with faith and doubt. It's just believing. I know that's a struggle that I've experienced in my life. Actually, I've experienced all of those struggles at certain points in my life. But Israel means struggles with God. And so if there have been times when you've struggled, like I've struggled, like most of us have struggled, I don't want you to feel bad about that because you're not alone. Israel literally means struggles with God. And that's just a part of the life of faith for people of faith. That is the first lesson. The second lesson is this: as people of faith, there will be times when we must persevere. As people of faith, there will be times when we must persevere. Because in this passage, Jacob has wrestled in this match where he realizes he's wrestling with God. Is there any way Jacob was going to win this wrestling match? No, not a chance. And at some point, God tried to gain the upper hand by knocking his hip out of socket. If it had been me, if I was wrestling with God and God knocked my hip out of socket, I would have been like, okay, I tap out. I quit. Uncle, I surrender. I'm waving the white flag. I'm done. But to his credit, not Jacob. Jacob persevered. God bless him. In fact, that's quite literally. That is quite literally what God did. God blessed Jacob because Jacob persevered. That is the second lesson. And the third lesson is this. As people of faith, there will be times when we must leave something behind. As people of faith, there will be times when we must leave something behind. So what do I mean by that? Well, in this passage, at one point, God says to Jacob, "What's your name?" As if he didn't know. And Jacob says, "Well, it's Jacob," which means, as we know, means deceiver. And God says, "All right, not anymore. Now you are Israel." Because what was God trying to say to Jacob here? God was trying to say to Jacob, you have been a deceiver your whole life. You deceived your father, you deceived your father-in-law, you deceived other people, you took advantage of your brother in a moment of weakness, and so you have got to leave that behind because that is not acceptable. And if you know the rest of the story of Jacob's life after this, you know that he did in fact leave the deceiver part of him on the other side of the river. You know that from that there forward that Jacob was a pretty decent character. And friends, I think for all of us, there are things that we need to leave behind. And for some people that may be an addiction. For some people that may be a behavior. For some people that may be a certain sin. Whatever you want to call it. I think all of us have something that we would recognize in our lives that we would say, yeah, I need to leave that behind. So my hope is that you can identify that and that you can make a resolution between you and God that you're going to leave behind whatever needs to be left behind, just as Jacob did. Well, that's where we're going to leave off today. You know, we've been talking about Jacob, but all of the great men and women of the Bible, I think, struggled with God at times. I would have you recall that even Jesus himself, when he was in the garden, he prayed, God, if there's any way this cup can be taken from me. And then he said, but not my will, but yours be done. And then he willingly went to the cross for us. And that is what we honor every time we gather around the Lord's table. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and grab my communion elements. I would encourage you to go ahead and grab yours. And we are going to go ahead and partake of communion together. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it, in remembrance of me." So, I would encourage you to go ahead and take your bread, as I take mine. The body of Christ, broken for us, we partake in remembrance of him. And the blood of Christ, shed for us, we drink in remembrance of him. Let's pray.